Now, we have heard from the innovator community. Now, the other key stakeholder is the public health community. And who better to ask to tell us what he thinks about what we should do in future than Sir Mark Walport. Sir Mark Walport is the Chief Scientific Advisor to Her Majesty's government and head of the Government Office for Science. He's also the co-chair of the UK Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. Before that, he was director of the Wellcome Trust, which is again one of the key global players in funding basic and applied healthcare research. And he had many other important career steps, like he was professor of medicine and head of the division of medicine at Imperial College of London. So again, a broad spectrum of activities. I heard Mark speak recently, and he said, in a presentation, he said, "My role is really where science meets values." And that resonated very much with me, because that is exactly what regulation is also about. We always pretended we were strictly scientific, but that's not true. There is values in there. So Mark, please tell us what you expect from us, both in the fields of science and values.
Thank you very much indeed, and let me reiterate the happy birthdays to the EMA. So the title, the exam question that I was given was, what do I expect from the EMA in the next 5 years? And I'm going to give a perspective from government. So what does government want? Government wants the health, the well-being, the resilience, and the security of us, populations of different governments, because we're a multinational audience. But it wants to be able to deliver that in an affordable, efficient, and effective fashion. And it also wants the enormously important industries that provide the medicines, the devices, the therapies, the vaccines that we need to contribute to our economy. And that, I think, is the challenge. And I admire what Elias has just said, because personally I agree with the vast majority of it. What do I expect from the EMA in the next 5 years? Well, we certainly couldn't do without you. But like, I think, any organization, we want you to continuously raise your game. And I think that's the challenge. My job is to advise the British government, as you've heard, on all aspects of science, engineering, technology, and social science for government policy. It's a very broad job. And one of the things that I've discovered is that discussions about science often get conflated with discussions about values. And actually, we've seen that recently in the context of the potential new therapies that could prevent the development of mitochondrial disease, which involve embryonic technologies. Now, there is the science of that, and then there are the values issues. And people hold very strong theological values about that. But I think that what sometimes goes wrong is that we confuse the two. And so it would not be appropriate for me to stand up here and talk about the theological details. And equally, I don't think that theologists should be actually questioning the science itself. I think that it's the role of democracies, it's the role of policymakers, it's the role of the people that we elect to govern us to reconcile the issues of the science on the one hand and the values on the other. And that has happened with that very clearly by non-party political votes in the Houses of Commons and Lords. And another challenge, I think, when you're advising in government is actually that people frequently talk at cross purposes. And we've heard a lot about risk this morning, but unfortunately, risk is often confused with hazard. And that's an extremely important distinction because, of course, risk is the product of hazard with exposure, with vulnerability. And however hazardous something is, if we have no exposure to it, then it poses no risk. And so a lot of my job is actually trying to be really clear about the arguments. Now, we've heard some discussion about regulatory science this morning. And I think that we really need to think about it in terms of the regulatory sciences. We've heard a lot about patients. And of course, one of the big challenges about patients is that, for very understandable reasons, they are impatient. They would like to see more pace. And I think that for regulators and all of us to be able to do our jobs properly, we need to actually understand the values of our patients. And to me, regulatory science needs to be a social science as much as a biological science and an exact science. I want to pick up the issue of data because that has come up again and again. And the potential in the new world of big data is that actually we follow drugs, other therapies throughout the lifetime of the administration to how people take them for the full period. And we actually have to build that into the regulatory pathway. And I would just point out that one of the important discussions in Brussels at the moment is about a European data regulation. And I would just urge everyone who is involved in the discussions about that to recognize the power of data to deliver better healthcare. Of course we must worry about privacy, but when you ask the people that are most concerned, all of us who take tablets, we actually want the best information. We want side effects to be discovered. We want to know who should take a drug, who shouldn't. The only way to find that out is by the relentless use of data. And of course, it's not the data, it's turning the data into information and the information into knowledge. So, the changing context for regulation, I'm going to say many of the same things that have been said already. But a really important thing is that form should follow function. And so regulators have got to be able to operate in what is a changing world of healthcare. And the big picture, again, taking a public health perspective, is that we need to move to integrated care, to care that is continuous between primary care, secondary care, and social care, where the record is shared, the management is seamless, because only by doing that will we give the most effective care to people, and at the same time help to hold down the costs. There's no doubt we are moving into a world of genomics, of proteomics, and of metabolomics, and as Elias has eloquently said, all of this, of course, we need to be able to measure the clinical features of the disease, the phenotype, and in many ways that's the hardest thing of all to measure. We're moving into a world of demographic change. We're all living much longer, or most of us are, and the diseases that are going to afflict us late in life have very long incubation periods. And so that is the challenge. Elias has used the example of diabetes. Well, dementia is the other example, where by the time clinical trials start in diseases such as Alzheimer's, the disease may have been going for more than 10 or 15 years, and the chances of achieving an effect are low. Can we, in the future, move to a world where you have the 25-year phase 3 trial before we introduce the drug? It's not feasible, it's not affordable, and we have to find other ways of doing those clinical trials. We are in a world that we're going through a second digital revolution at the moment. So we have the Internet of Things, a world in which almost everything is sensed. It will be possible to sense the tablet, to know when we've swallowed it. So how do we actually get the most out of all of the information that we'll now be able to get about compliance? And I'll say a little bit more about the challenge that was brought up earlier of counterfeiting, because that is a major challenge to all of us. There's the issue of affordability and the issue I've already raised, that healthcare shouldn't be seen as a liability, it should actually be seen as an economic asset. Complexity, everyone's talked about complexity, and I won't spend long about this, but we are in an era where it should be possible to have digitally informed healthcare systems. At the end of the day, you do need analog humans as well, but there's no question that the digital sciences are actually, the technologies are going to change the way we deliver healthcare. And that's all about, again, it's about function. The form should follow function. We need a vision. It's about better practice. And you saw on the slide that Elias showed the rather small amount of work that's invested in money that's invested in the healthcare systems themselves and understanding them. We need digital health to make drug therapy more effective, more efficient, more accountable. We have to use technologies to make all of us more accountable for what we do. And of course, we can monitor things in a much more detailed way. And I absolutely agree with Elias about the importance of developing treatments for diseases that affect large numbers of us. But the other side of the coin is that as we've discovered more and more about the heterogeneity of diseases. So diseases such as diabetes, well, we knew about type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but of course there are now an increasing different variety of types of diabetes. So common diseases themselves, to some extent, will become the confluence of a series of less common diseases, and that's a challenge to understand as well. And of course, we're moving into a world where we will apply drugs with much greater dose flexibility, as long as we can regulate in a way that enables that dose flexibility to happen. Combination therapies. As we live longer, I learned very early as a young doctor that you need more and more tablets as you get older and older. So how do we manage combination therapies? How do we monitor them? And we really can measure compliance in ways that weren't possible. So I think that regulation will have a much more important role throughout the whole lifetime of a medicine. But if it's going to extend across the lifetime of a medicine, it's actually got to make it more efficient and less costly, rather than more burdensome and more costly. So I think regulation needs to be smarter in 5 different ways. It needs to have greater pace, it needs to have greater efficacy and efficiency and effectiveness rather, the regulatory process itself. It needs to be able to cope with precision medicine and with personalization, but equally it needs to be able to cope with the complexity that others have described. I really don't think we're going to be doing the job properly unless we analyze the entire lifetime of a drug use. So the blurring of what is a phase 3 and a phase 4 and then just general use, that's going to happen, because as long as we use data properly, we'll be able to collect data right through the lifetime of a drug. And all of this, I'm afraid, has got to be much more affordable. Now, innovation itself is sometimes viewed as increasing risk. But of course, what we need to do, given the challenges that we face, is that we need to use innovation to reduce the risks we face. And of course, I have to advise government on all of science and engineering, and so I have to think about energy as well, where again, looking to the future, if we're to mitigate and prevent the effects of humans releasing 10 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere each year, then we need to be innovative in our energy R&D and systems as well. The pace of response to diseases should be needs-led, and I'll talk about Ebola in just a second. And the regulatory process, frankly, needs to match the pace of need from patients. And it is possible to do that without compromising safety. I don't think the job of the regulator is to be a cheerleader, and we talk a lot about trust, but the corollary of trust is demonstrating that you are trustworthy. And for regulators, I think, to be really seen as trustworthy, that's got to mean that new treatments can be delivered, treatments that we need, and preferably at a cost we can afford. And of course, that isn't entirely the regulators, because they're regulating products that are made and developed by others. But they are complicit in the process. I think there are a series of generic challenges to regulation at the moment, and these do not all apply to EMA, FDA, drugs regulators, but a number of them do. So one is the challenge of the pure economic regulator, and in fact, drugs regulators are not economic regulators per se, but the danger of pure economic regulation is that the price is driven down at the expense of R&D and resilience. The second challenge, which I think is a challenge to all regulators, is the challenge of asymmetric incentives. And what I mean by that is that if a regulator allows something to happen that causes harm, then they get into very severe trouble. If they stop something happening that would have done good, then there are really no consequences. And that is, I think, a big problem. And unless we find mechanisms to hold regulators to account for all of the decisions they make, whether to stop or to permit, then I think we're going to have this challenge of asymmetric incentives. I think the third challenge, where I believe something is being done, is what I call encrusted regulation, where more and more stuff gets bunged in, and it's very difficult to take stuff out. And I think that's just a challenge for everyone. Is it really necessary to do X in order to improve the safety of the product that you're regulating? And I think that question has got to be asked continuously. And finally, I think there is the whole challenge of regulation in the context when science meets values. And actually, I would hold up the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority in the UK as an example of a regulator working in an area of emerging technology that not only regulates the process, but conducts the public engagement with patients, conducts the public engagement with policymakers, and at the end of the day, hands it over for legislative decisions to be made and then regulates on the basis of the science. So there are ways that I think regulators need to work when science is particularly challenging to, when values really meets regulation. Now, vaccines. I think vaccines are a very interesting and challenging example. The truth is we haven't had a vaccine ready for this Ebola epidemic. And I have been frankly stunned at the discussion of the idea that there could be placebo-controlled trials of a vaccine with a disease that has a 70% mortality. I chaired a research ethics committee, and the first thing you learn when you're chairing a research ethics committee is the issue of equipoise. That it's only ethical to do something if the risks are balanced to the patient in both arms of the study. And I suppose my question about an Ebola vaccine would be if anyone here living in West Africa would have held out their arm knowing they were going to receive a placebo. And I think that's the sort of challenge, and it comes back to, Elias has raised the question, there's many ways of doing clinical studies, and we have to find innovative ways of doing them. Flu, I think, is another challenge for us. The reality is that if there was a new flu pandemic of a hemagglutinin neuraminidase combination that isn't out there at the moment, it would have had its first sweep around the world by the time we had a vaccine. And vaccines, of course, are an example where there's inherent complexity in the regulation because, in fact, there are three components. There's the adjuvant, there's the antigen or antigens in it, and then there's the carrier for the vaccine. We have to find ways of regulating in a much more efficient and effective way these cassettes. Otherwise, we simply will not be able to deliver to the populations around the world that need them the vaccines in the time that is needed. And whilst it was acceptable to do vaccines for flu the way we were doing them 20 or 30 years ago, technology has moved on. The power of molecular genetics now means that in principle we can all do this much faster. And so I think that regulation has actually, we've got to think about it actually as how it drives innovation, at least as much as how it potentially inhibits it. We have to sort of get the balance right between innovation and precaution. And that's the asymmetric incentive issue where I've talked about better accountability. We've got to find novel approaches to accelerate the adoption of new innovations. We clearly have to find ways of incentivizing therapies for neglected diseases and neglected groups. And that's an area where the frank discussion is about who is going to pay. And we need to think about regulation in terms of whether it can promote and mandate new, better approaches, or whether it just waits to respond to them. And so this is another area where I think there's going to be a dramatic change in the way we administer and take our drugs. I don't think it's any longer a question of, is it a good drug generically? Is it the right drug in the right combination for the right person? That's the question we have to ask. And how is regulation going to support a personalized approach? Dramatically different approaches to the same treatment in different people. And this is an area where technology can do an enormous amount, and I think in a way it's ready, we could do this now. Technology is going to be increasingly important in guaranteeing the provenance of a drug, in dealing with counterfeits, because this is actually a global problem. And there are technologies there to do that. And equally, we can use technology to work out when I swallow my tablet. And that's about integrating other products into the pill so that we swallow them at the same time, and it not only tells us, it gives us the therapeutic effect, but tells us we've swallowed it. And how we integrate with digital care systems more generally. And I think that we are going to have to move to a world where the regulator stays much more involved after the licensing of a drug. So, what are the implications for trials and regulations? Imagine we have the data on all of the use of drugs and can start measuring efficacy, measure side effects. I think it blurs the lines between the classical clinical trial phases and the phases when drugs are just used in as it were, ordinary clinical practice. And I think it just pushes along the line that I believe regulators are already going, which is to much more adaptive and conditional licensing regimes. Now, this slide and the image is entirely appropriate for today because pretty much around now, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, will be standing up in the House of Commons to deliver his budget. But I think that there is no sense that austerity is over and efficiency imperative is as true for regulators as it is for all of us and the NHS. So it's not all a regulator's job. I think it comes back to a partnership, the sort of discussion that Elias was having. I think that industry has got a responsibility to work with healthcare systems, with, in fact, politicians, with general publics, to actually produce the medicines that we all most need. And that requires, of course, us, the health community, also giving a clearer description of our needs. And I think that regulators have a very important role as conveners of conversations. And of course, in some senses, this celebration of your 20th birthday is an example of that convening. So to finish off, in 5 years, I think we need you, EMA and regulators in general, to be actually driving innovation through regulation. I think we need you to have systems that can ensure that a personalized approach is the norm rather than the exception, that you can handle complexity in terms of combinations, in terms of dose variables, that you've found ways to regulate vaccines more effectively. You need to be able to match the pace demanded by the clinical need so that we do not have an influenza pandemic that has swept around the world before we have a vaccine for it. And I think that you need to enable us to use the digital technologies to ensure the provenance, the right dosing, and the measurement of the responses to therapy. So thank you for your attention.
So, thank you too, Mark. Excellent. I found it particularly refreshing for the following reason. We know that we have two roles. We're a gatekeeper and we're an enabler. And for the past 20 years of our existence, we have been criticized by the industry for failing on the enabler side, and we have been criticized by the public side for failing on the gatekeeper side. Now, for the first time in my career here, I hear someone from government calling on us to take better care of the enabler side. So this is a new one, and I'm very grateful for that. And you said it again, of course, in the nicest possible way. Now, regrettably, Mark has to leave because he has another commitment at the government in the afternoon. We're not so running late, so there is an opportunity for 1 or 2 questions from the floor, if you have them, specifically for Mark. As I said, Elias would be here in the early afternoon. Are there any questions for Mark? If not, let me ask you a question. You were so very nice and diplomatic. Were you saying between the lines that we are a little slow in adopting new technologies, not drug, but non-drug technologies like sensors, like tracers of compliance, etc., big data approaches?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is that, you know, one of the privileges of my job is to get out and see science, engineering, technology in the UK, around the world, and I'm just seeing the opportunities all the time for integrating the world of sensors with the world of medicines and drugs. And what I don't know, so I need to be very careful, is how many of these approaches you're receiving, whether you're turning them down, how effectively you're regulating them. But I just put it to you that a challenge that I think this is something you really do need to be able to do effectively and proportionately. And I think that's the challenge for all of the regulations. It's about proportionality.
Okay. Thank you. Message received. Peggy.
A question that you're perhaps uniquely positioned to talk about is how can we really drive the research agenda that needs to be done to support many of the things you were talking about? I mean, I was particularly struck when you said the regulator needs to keep pace. I don't know, do I need to start my question
No. Well, no,
It's being streamed.
You said the regulator needs to keep pace, but, you know, for example, with more modern and effective influenza vaccine. It's not regulatory standards
Yeah.
that are slowing that, or in so many other areas, the identification and use of new biomarkers. It's really that we don't have the deepened understanding of human biology and response to disease that is the limiting factor, as well as, in some cases, applying the right technology to product development. And, when I look at what's happening, I see huge gaps in terms of the kind of research that's for the common good, that supports the advance of innovation and enables the regulator to be the gatekeeper or the facilitator of innovation. But I don't think we've figured out how to really support the science.
That's a really good question, and it's a question about who sets the research agenda, I think. And it's the balance between the bottom-up funding that medical researchers are used to, where they come to an NIH or a Wellcome Trust or an MRC and say, this is our ideas, as opposed to the needs that you as a regulator, that the Department of Health might have for R&D. And I mean, it seems to me that actually we need a balance between the two, but there do need to be applied buckets of research funding which can actually incentivize people to answer some of these critical questions, which they might not do left to their own devices. And I think that is one of the challenges. Who should pay for this research? Should the regulators themselves have an R&D budget so that you can commission research? I think it's an interesting question. But if you did, who would pay it? And I suspect that Elias and his colleagues might be a bit reserved about contributing yet more in fees to enable you to do it. Should this be something that in the UK the Department of Health might fund, or the Medical Research Council? It's a good question, but you're right, there is an applied research agenda that is needed, and I think there's an interesting question about the capacity of the research community to answer some of these questions as well.
Thank you. I do not see any other burning question, so thank you both, all our speakers, for this morning, and I think they deserve a round of great applause.